Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chris Kirk, Stone & Chalk's General Manager here in Adelaide, and while it seems like a small room here in Adelaide, we've actually got over 100 people that have joined us online. So welcome everyone that's joined us online for today's event, titled The Future is Here, Flying Cars and Autonomous Vehicles. This is the second in a new series that we're running called The Future is Here series. And we're very lucky today to be joined by some brilliant speakers who I'll introduce in a second, as well as a panel online. We will start today's event with a 10-minute presentation from Rocky Scopeletti. For those of you that don't know Rocky, we're incredibly lucky to have him. He's given short presentations at a couple of our events. He's a renowned futurologist. He's been featured in Forbes at the World Economic Forum, and will give a short and quite thought-provoking presentation around the future of mobility. We'll then pass to our panel, and we're incredibly lucky to be joined by Rita Excell today. Rita, I'll introduce in a second, but is far more qualified than me to moderate this topic, and I was very lucky when you came aboard, Rita, so fantastic to have you, and I will introduce you in a second. Just very quickly, some housekeeping. So we're trying to keep today's event as conversational as possible. For anyone here in the room, we'll pass around a microphone. Please feel free to fire questions. And for those that are online, please just use the Q&A function, and we'll attempt to get to as many questions in the moderated discussion a little bit later on today. Without further ado, I will introduce Rocky. Rocky, welcome.
Hi, everyone.
And thanks again for letting us draft you in for round two of today's presentation. For those of you who haven't met Rocky before, he's not actually in Men in Black. Those are transitioning eyeglasses. But Rocky, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here. And without further ado, I'll pass to you to give a little bit of context and really to set some framing around today's discussion on the future of autonomous vehicles and flying cars. Over to you, man.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris, and welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to spend this time with you. I'm going to take you through some insights around the topic that I've recently published in my new book titled Australia 2030, Where the Bloody Hell Are We? Now, the areas that I'm going to touch on and that we will then further expand on in the discussion with Zach, Greg and Rita and Chris is firstly beginning with thinking about the decade ahead from a programmatic perspective. And once you start thinking about, life as we will see it, the word programmatic is quite important in terms of just thinking about the way with which we will be able to take an idea and turn that idea into an outcome. I'll also outline some of the major technological shifts that we will be experiencing increasingly so over the coming decade, and importantly anchor that around the fourth industrial revolution. And then I'll sort of round it out with a taste of some of those predictions that I've made in relation to the decade ahead. Okay, so let's just begin by looking at some of the emerging technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. Those are on your screen on the left-hand side. Now, in a study that looking at how Australian executives think about these technologies and which of these do they believe is going to have a impact, a low impact, a high impact, or no impact at all over the coming 3 years, we can unsurprisingly see that, cyber and information security, the Internet of Things, advanced wireless networks, blockchain, data and analytics, AI, all feature in that sort of top 6. Now, again, that's unsurprising in many respects. But I think what is important is that we ground ourselves in the common element associated with all of those technologies, and that is data. And so these technologies will exponentially be optimized through data. And so the emphasis is really on sort of making sure that our transformations around data systems are really ready for these emerging technologies. Now, to give you just sort of a rough feel for when we believe these technologies will become, I guess, or hit the top of their hype, we can see that they will unfold over the coming decade. Now, what I mean by the programmatic decade is just a couple of things. Firstly, our physical reality virtualized will be our reality. It will be very difficult for us to distinguish the difference between an experience in our physical reality and our virtual reality. Some of the other really important developments from a programmatic perspective is that transportation will be operated by non-human intelligent systems. Now, I'm sure Zach, Greg, and Rita and the team will talk more about this, but I put the emphasis here on systems rather than just necessarily thinking about transportation as though it's something independent of all of the other non-human intelligent devices and things that are going to be out there. The other important programmatic element here is what I refer to as wearable technology. Now, wearable technology will be everywhere, and the underlying enabler of that is the advent of fifth generation technology, miniaturization, and a whole range of other things. Now, when we think about autonomous structures, what we've also got to appreciate is that it's not just the unit interacting with something on a bilateral basis. We need to think about our interactions in a highly sensory way from a unilateral perspective. So in other words, it's not just one thing that we're going to be connected or reacting or responding to. In fact, it'll be it will be many. Okay, so now this is probably the single most important takeaway I hope you all get from this, and that is that we often hear about all of these wonderful technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's blockchain, whether it's all of these things, 5G, virtual reality, as though they're all independent of one another. Now, the idea here is, yes, they are very, very powerful technologies, make no mistake about that. But it's the multiplicative effect that occurs when these technologies are used collectively. And I'll give you some examples. The first is when you put AI and cloud together, it profoundly changes the way with which we have the capacity of efficiently managing the way with which we originate data, the way we then translate that data and then react to it in whatever direction it's being given. The second is when you put IoT devices together with 5G networks, augmented reality technologies, all of a sudden you're able to create experiences and make decisions much more effectively than what we could if these things were operating independent of one another. And then lastly, the way that we think about trust is going to profoundly change, and it's something I've been talking quite a lot about, is because we're shifting from a world where the primary question of trust is who do we trust, into an environment around what do we trust, and the what is going to be everything from data to all of the devices and things. Now, what puts all of this sort of ecosystem on steroids is our capacity to process information at quantum levels, which is the quantum computing. So again, think about the collective power of these technologies when used collectively. Now, when it comes to looking at autonomy, autonomous technologies, I would sort of bring that down into three areas: personalization, convenience, and transparency. Now, you're going to hear some wonderful initiatives from Zach with Swoop Aero, where we are using remedial logistics for on-demand healthcare, and I think that's a wonderful case study to just think about the extent to which personalisation will be able to occur through autonomous technologies. Now, it'll transform the in-car experience. And we've had a flavour of this in some respects with some of the entertainment systems that were first rolled out in cities like New York, less so in Europe. But it'll open up completely new business models for the way with which organisations think about entertainment and advertising, let alone the fact of how we think about using our time. And instead of our time being, I guess, sitting idle, given that we can't use our phones, or shouldn't be using our phones in cars, that transportation will become, much more valuable in terms of the way that we think about our time. Now, when we use autonomous systems, we can all of a sudden rethink the measures that we've had in place to manage things like congestion. I just drove back on the weekend on the Sturt Highway across New South Wales, and it was so frustrating sitting behind a caravan that was only doing 70 kilometres an hour in a 110 zone. And you kind of think, you should be doing 110. If you can't do the speed limit, pull over. So, congestion is largely a function of human error in driving, and autonomous vehicles will reduce that by a programmed flow of traffic on all kinds of different roadway systems. And then lastly, flying vehicles. Now, these aren't just drones. These are vehicles that we'll be using to commute. Are certainly going to require a complete rethink of our regulatory environment and infrastructure. So, in terms of now this is just a taste of some of the predictions in my new book. I've got about 37 of them, but here's some of the ones that are really relevant, I think, to this topic. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but I'll touch on some. The first is that data is becoming increasingly hypercritical. Okay, and what I mean by hypercritical means that, life, systems, the economy, all of those things will increasingly become dependent on data and its performance through those systems. Now, there's no better case studies around when you think about autonomous vehicles, be they flight, rail systems, transport systems, or just motor vehicles, where this hypercriticalness of the data that's informing those fleets or those systems is critical to life. The second area is then what I refer to is that our physical world is going to become interconnected and then intelligent. Now, what's important here is that when we think about connectivity, it's not just the ability to connect to this wonderful new 5th generation mobile technology, but get excited about satellites, right? Get excited about satellites. Over the coming years, there's going to be over 26,000 satellites in all forms of constellations that are going to provide all sorts of connectivity at ultra low cost, but most importantly, are going to be providing a lot of the support systems for these, particularly the aerial and the logistical systems that, that wireless connectivity simply can't. And so I'd say, get excited about SATs. SATs are back. Okay, let's look at some of the results of some of the research that I, again, published in my new book. I've got some bad news for Richard Branson and Elon Musk. When we look at the question of what people think they're going to be experiencing in 2030, recreational travel to outer space was not one of them. It was one of the least there, but we can expect new treatments for illnesses that impact all of us directly or indirectly as being one of the areas that we think we will experience in much better off. Now, again, in a future retrospective question, looking at their, putting yourself in 2030 and asking yourself, your perspectives on technological and scientific advancements, overwhelmingly so, Australians believe that technological and scientific advancements will have had a very positive impact on our social, cultural, and economic future. So I'll just close it there. Again, everything that I've mentioned, it's just a taste of it, is in the books that I've published, with my latest being Australia 2030. And I'll hand back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Rocky. That's brilliant. So to summarise, no recreational travel, unfortunately, to space, but 26,000 satellites and some fantastic conversations happening at the moment at Lot 14. We're actually hosting an event next week with Lloyd Damp, CEO of Southern Launch, who was responsible for launching one of the first test launches from South Australia in decades. So if you're interested in that space, encourage you to check that one out. But without further ado, I'd love now to pass to Rita Excell. Rita is the director of the Australian and New Zealand Driverless Vehicle Initiative and has a wealth of insight around the topic. And she'll also introduce our brilliant panel to start to really unpack some of the themes that Rocky explored or touched on then, and also to open to the room for questions. So please, if you've got any questions, just stick your hand up, or for those that are online, just drop it into the Q&A and we'll make sure we get to them as well.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to Stone and Chalk for putting this on. It's a great discussion topic. And I'm glad that we've had an opportunity to get together, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions once I introduce our great experts today. So next to me in Adelaide here, Greg Giraud from Easymile, and Zach Kennedy over, I don't know, where are you based? Are you in Sydney or Melbourne? For my COVID's sake, I hope.
Melbourne, me.
Melbourne. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so maybe Greg, give us a little bit of background about yourself and your company, just to set the scene.
Sure. I'm Greg Giraud. Good job on the pronunciation, Rita, of the last name. I'm the managing director for Easymile in Australia and New Zealand. Originally from Tahiti in French Polynesia, as you can tell from the accent. And my background is in car sharing. I was looking after Hertz car share operations in Melbourne for about 10 years. So still in the sector of new mobility, but not quite driverless vehicles. As Easymile in the region, we're one of the leading providers of autonomous shuttle. We're actually the only autonomous shuttle business to have a local presence in Australia. And our offices are based just around the corner at Lot 14 in Adelaide. We've deployed our shuttle on about 10 projects in Australia, mostly state commissioned by the state government. And we're poised to replicate some of the successes that Easymile has seen overseas as well, maybe even in terms of manufacturing in the future, who knows.
Thanks, Greg. And welcome to this session. We look forward to hearing about your projects. Zach, do you want to give us a bit of a background to you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Zach Kennedy. I'm the head of regulatory affairs for Swoop Aero. I have previously worked for the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, and then after that, Qantas Group, focusing on regulatory engagement, safety management, and group assurance. On the Swoop Aero side, so we're an aeromedical logistics company that transforms the way the world moves essential supplies. We're Australian born and bred and have a bit of a global reach, and we bring healthcare logistics into the 21st century by deploying a two-way drone network. Our managed air transport service provides access to the skies to ensure sustainable, safe and reliable provisions of essential health supplies. Unmanned vehicles are at the heart of the next significant shift in supply chain logistics, as Rocky said. and we focus on having the right systems and the right solutions for the global problems.
Great, thanks very much. Just a bit about the format today. We're going to have some questions that I'll pose to our experts, and also pleased to take questions from the audience. Obviously, that's a part of sharing and knowledge sharing. It's understanding what you want to hear about too. So we've got experts in aviation or aerial autonomous vehicles and land autonomous vehicles. And I think we'll hear from Greg about some industrial and domestic applications of those, and also Zach. So Greg, starting with you, maybe you can give us a bit of a foray into, you know, some of the exciting projects that you've been working on and planning to work on.
Sure. I've got one very exciting project, which is actually, you know, in our backyard in South Australia. I think, you know, the theme of the event is the future is here. And I want to flag that autonomous vehicle deployment, as you well know, Rita, actually happening as we speak. One such project is in Renmark, which is a regional town about 3 hours away from Adelaide. And we're about to relaunch in the service in a second phase. And what we're trying to create in Renmark is really a blueprint for autonomous public transportation in regional areas. As Easymile, our bread and butter is really shared mobility and the first and last mile complementing the existing public transport. And I think way too often when we talk about transport and mobility, we tend to focus on urban centers, but we also have very big challenges in our regional areas, in our rural communities. And, you know, especially looking at a country like Australia, there's a big and long history of automation in regional areas. If we look at our mining, if we look at our agriculture, so I find that fitting that for autonomous transport, we're starting from the regional as well. So look, this project is going to relaunch in the next couple of months. If you happen to be on holidays in the Riverland areas by the end of the year, make sure that you try the service so you can actually see the technology in action, because it's extremely a different experience, you know, to actually experience it directly. And actually, you know, what we're seeing is that the perception of people will flip after they try autonomous vehicle, and they would be ready to accept this technology and use it on a regular basis. So if you're in Renmark before the end of the year, make sure that you hop on our autonomous shuttle there. A piece of innovation that's actually hot off the press, which, you know, is a great partnership. We've announced just last week a partnership with the US manufacturing, automotive manufacturer, Phoenix Motor Car, to develop a mid-size bus. And it's very typical of our approach and strategy as Easymile to form partnership with OEMs to essentially automate new vehicle platform. So, you know, for example, we've automated a tramway in partnership with Alstom, which is the rolling stock manufacturer providing tram for Adelaide, Sydney, and other capital cities in the world. We're working on a 12-meter bus with Iveco as well. So we're not just looking at that first and last mile piece, we're looking at servicing other use cases with different type of vehicles as well. What's exciting with that partnership in the US is that we're working on a platform that is already compliant for the US open roads, that is compliant with transport accessibility and the American Disability Act as well. So by working on a platform that's ready for the roads already, we take care of that, of a very big part of the regulation aspect, and that makes it easier when you automate this platform basically. So very exciting project.
It is very exciting. Thanks for sharing that with us. A bit of a scoop for everybody on this webinar today. And I think, you know, if I recall, you actually launched first in Darwin. So you have no concerns, obviously, having a technical team in Australia. You're being able to service the whole of Australia remotely from the Lot 14 expertise. And you've had some regional projects also in New South Wales as well. So when we think of first and last mile, we think of urban areas, but I think fundamentally the real barriers are in regional areas, particularly that are underserviced by public transport. So congratulations on that. To Rocky's point, and obviously to what you've said, is about all these things joining together, and with your technology and partnering with companies as well, like Alstom. It's really translating that into reality, isn't it? That partnering approach. So I suppose the question, and I do a lot of these and I get asked all the time, and it's great for me to be able to ask somebody else. So how do you expect driverless technology to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years? And what do you think might be the catalyst to accelerate it?
Look, I think, firstly, I think, we're in an industry where we're seeing a lot of overhype. 5, 10 years ago, I think that we had a bit underestimated the challenge that's replacing the human driver, which is an incredibly complex and difficult engineering feat. I think that the industry has matured up a bit, and we've shied away making this very bold prediction, some of which had forecasted that we'd have hundreds of thousands of robotaxi in the street of LA and New York by the end of this year. And I don't see that happening. And it wouldn't have even happened, without the pandemic. So, to me, I think that to reach true level 5 automation, which is autonomous vehicle in any condition, in any operational design domain, I think we're a good 10, 15 years away from that. But in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a number of applications that's really going to pull up the technological and regulatory development in that space. I'll probably see, let's say, 4 key segments that are really going to push that. Robotaxi, at the moment, there's a lot of projects in China, especially in the US as well. We still have a safety operator behind the wheel. But in some areas, you can catch an autonomous ride, using your app the same way that you'd catch an Uber. Public transportation, I think, that's a sector that's poised to push that autonomy as well. And that's really our bread and butter as Easymile again. And, if you think about segregated domain like tram tracks, trains, or even bus rapid transit, where you have a lane that's completely segregated from the rest of the traffic, I think these are some use cases that are within reach for automation. Another one is freight and trucking. If you look at a country like Australia, the US as well, we have a lot of very straight, very long freeways where the traffic is reduced, which create an ideal environment for this kind of technology. So we could be in a situation where you've got a loading bay at the departure point, one at the arrival, where the driver will take control when you get to a more complex environment, but in between you could have these trucks and this, this freight vehicle just driving in autonomous mode. And the last one that, to me really accelerated during the pandemic is the last mile delivery. Firstly, you have to remember that last mile delivery is the most costly part of the supply chain. So there's a real economic challenge to solve from that regard. The second thing is the safety case is a lot simpler and easier than for autonomous vehicle on road. Instead of having a 3-ton vehicle, that's going to do 50, 60K per hour on an open road with mixed traffic, we've got a smaller type of vehicle that's on the sidewalk. So I think, the safety concern is a lot less. And finally, I think the pandemic really created a need and the realization that although we might be stuck at home due to a major disaster, a pandemic like it's currently the case, companies still need to churn out their product to the market, and online shopping still need to be delivered. So, I think that really pushed that segment, in the right direction, and to also drive some of that technological progress. The second part of your question was, regarding what's the catalyst. Look, the main thing, and that's the holy grail for every company in that ecosystem, we need to remove the human touch and remove the safety operator. And again, that's going to take time, but in some operational design domain, we're already able to do that, especially on private sites, business park, industrial park. That's something that is possible because we've got a captive, audience, and also because the domain is a bit simplified compared to an open road in a city center. And by the same token, the technology progressing and maturing is going to help us with the supply chain aspect. At the moment, the main part of our bill of material in vehicle manufacturing comes from the sensor and the robotic components. And as the supply chain and the value chain develops, this is going to bring the cost of the vehicle down, which is going to make them more affordable and eventually able to compete with traditional vehicle. It's something that we've seen with electric vehicle currently, which is very topical. think about the price 10, 15 years ago, and the price of electric vehicle now, you know, they're a lot more affordable thanks to the price of batteries and components that have gone down. And finally, the last, you know, catalyst to me will be the connectivity. Connectivity to everything, infrastructure, pedestrian, other vehicle, which is really going to make, I guess, our vehicles smarter and able to predict some of the behavior and help with the flow of traffic as well, to Rocky's point, you know, to make them more efficient in the way they drive.
Thanks very much, Greg. And I think what we're seeing evolving over the last few years is the pillars that we need in place, the connectivity, the zero emission vehicles to make this technology deliver the efficiencies and the benefits. They are sort of coming into place and probably cementing the reality of those. Some of the things Rocky talked about blockchain and AI, the advancements that are happening in those sectors that are complementary. When Google started developing their driverless vehicle in 2009, there wasn't a lot of this in place, but now it seems to be fundamentally, you know, we expect that electric or zero emission cleaner vehicles will be in place before driverless, whether it's level 4 or level 5 is in place. So I think that there's some really fundamental signs around the advancement. So thank you for that. So Greg, you're a global company. Is there a case study that's happening internationally that you think might have some great relevance for Australia, an Australian application, or that, you know, we could just plug and play one of those applications or tailor it for Australian conditions?
There are many case studies, you know, in other parts of the world, as you know, and there's a lot of these use cases, you know, that we see in Australia as well. And, you know, we'd be very keen to be able to replicate some of this project. One project that's a very good case study for the Australian market is the project of Barkarby in Sweden, which is in the greater Stockholm area. Barkarby is a master plan community. It's the largest residential development in Northern Europe. And the government and the developer and the public transit operator have decided to do things a bit differently. The first thing is that they wanted to put a lot of pressure on private car ownership. You know, they wanted to ingrain shared mobility and public transport behavior very early on in the Barkarby community. You know, to Rocky's point earlier, congestion is really one of the cancer of our modern society. So they didn't want to create this kind of problem. In Barkarby, I think you've got 1 parking space for 3 dwellings, which would be incredible, you know, to have such a development in Australia. So, you know, we've got a very long love affair with private car ownership. What they've decided to do is create a new bus line as a first and last mile connection to service the shopping in the precinct, the transport hub as well. And this bus line is entirely serviced by a fleet of 4 of our autonomous shuttles, providing that first mile, last mile mobility service to the community. And I think it's, you know, it's an excellent example for the Australian market because we're seeing very strong population growth and we're developing a lot of master plan community as well. If you look at a corridor like Southeast Queensland, which is the fastest population growth corridor in Australia at the moment, there's a lot of this community that are being developed. And if we don't get at the urban design stage, thinking about autonomous vehicle, thinking about micro-mobility solution and a holistic approach to transport within these communities, we're going to do the same thing that we've done for, you know, for decades and decades, which is excavating public land to build a gazillion of parking spaces to park assets like private cars that we use less than 10% of time. So I think that, you know, there's a strong case for Barkarby like project in Australia. And we're seeing master plan communities starting to have that interest and starting approaching us at various stages of the development. Some of them are already developed, but they don't have, they cannot afford to have a full-blown transport solution because they don't have the population and the density yet. And some of them are design stage, you know, which is really the part that interests us because you can be like, well, hang on, instead of putting 3 car park per dwelling, maybe we can put only 1 or 2 and you know, build a home office because, you know, who knows, there might be another pandemic in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's an excellent project. And the other one, very briefly, is Singapore, which, as you know, is in terms of autonomous vehicle readiness, is the #1 market in the world. The government has a strong vision. They've got a strong regulatory framework, which we have in Australia as well. But the difference is that Singapore are putting their money where their mouth is, and they're willing to fund this project because they understand that we need to take the community by the hand and win that acceptance and get them used to this kind of solution. So Singapore is looking at a very ambitious project to create a fully autonomous integrated public transport system in selected area of the city-state. It's a project for the long haul. There's different type of vehicle for different use cases, but that's the kind of project that we need in Australia to pull the industry up and create a favorable environment and ecosystem for the autonomous vehicle industry.
Yes, and thank you for that. So Singapore just won the race to be the #1 country for the Autonomous Vehicle Readiness Index that was released in July this year. So they've been, celebrating being #1. And I think fundamentally it's really, we've got a huge opportunity like that in Australia. We have the Office of Future Transport, which is a Commonwealth office with a focus on this whole ecosystem of future transport and mobility. And we think that, there's huge opportunities to look at that model and also some of the other models that you're familiar with, government's role as an enabler and being a customer, particularly for public transport solutions and safety solutions. So yeah, there's great synergies there. Australia is not quite #1, but we aspire to be in the top 10 probably in the next few years.
#1 in regulations, no?
Yes, #1 in regulations. We're very good at regulating. And speaking of regulations, nothing's more regulated than probably the airspace. So I'm going to introduce Zach. So just bring Zach into the conversation here now. And welcome to this event, Zach, and thanks for joining us. So I've got a question to you. Through the use of drones, Swoop Aero have been able to transform the way the world moves and with essential supplies. And I suppose that's fundamentally a really sound use case, and we can't see the community necessarily rejecting that. Do you want to give us, how you see that evolving and give us a bit of an example of some of the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, and thank you for having me. I think in terms of a type of scenario and an everyday activity for us, I often get notifications on Slack saying that we've delivered 9 emergency medical supplies in one day. So that same sort of trip would have taken waiting for a boat with a schedule, a full drive trip, and maybe a minimum of 2 days for each of those 9 deliveries. And that's something that generally takes us a few hours for all deliveries. And the difference that time makes to a patient or someone who's undergoing surgery or needs medication is everything. And I think when that type of emergency delivery first happened, it was an amazing feeling, and it was an amazingly proud moment for the team that someone's life was saved. However, it's now a consistent and reliable method for places like Malawi, DR Congo, and Rwanda, the district's health centres there, that enables them to provide the best possible healthcare. So happening once is amazing, but being able to replicate that and have that reliable and consistent delivery is just brilliant for us. I think in terms of expanding and what the sort of operations are, so our goal is to service 100 million people by 2025. So in doing that, we're not just looking to expand for the sake of it. We want to make sure we're helping to solve a problem. I think very often drones are used for any problem that pops up. We want to make sure that they're used for the right purpose in the right use case. And it's the right solution for whatever problem is presented. And most commonly for us at the moment, that's the tyranny of distance and geography, much like Greg mentioned before. So one of the, I suppose, more exciting things that we're doing at the moment is opening up the largest two-way medical logistics network in the world. So in DR Congo, which we're using to save hours and days from medical supplies. And that's often the difference between people surviving or not, which is super exciting.
Yes, thanks, Zach. So I suppose looking at Australia and the tyranny of distance and those sorts of things, there's some comparable applications, particularly in our really remote regional locations around getting to people who've been involved in a workplace injury or some sort of a crash. So Are you exploring how that might work with the current regulations that are in place around drones?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you were mentioning before, there's lots of good use cases overseas that can be transplanted directly to Australia. In a lot of instances, there are own use cases from other countries in Africa and the Asia Pacific. In Australia, I think the regulations do make it a bit more tough. The regulator does use an internationally agreed framework and approach to complex operations such as ours. So it's not just Johnny, who's 7 years old flying in a park. It's complex operations beyond visual line of sight over cities. And that approach that they use is sound and risk-based and informed experts, which is fantastic. But I think it's the additional layers of interpretation, lack of clearer substantiated additional requirements, and above all, lack of timeliness from them, which is a bit of a killer for us. So we're actively working on a few applications with CASA, which is really exciting for Australia. But it took more than 6 months for them to even look at the applications, just because they're quite busy. And that was even with the assistance of successive letters of support from members of Parliament. I think you might have noted the other day that Google Wing announced an expansion due to demand, which is really exciting for them. However, it was a bit disappointing to see CASA prioritising things like delivery of donuts by drone over that humanitarian, public health and public good operation. So for us, I suppose persistence is key with getting through those regulatory hurdles. And I think places like New Zealand have taken a bit more of a pragmatic and whole of government approach, which is really interesting, which, to be fair, Australia is now trying to do as well. And then the comparable with other places or other countries in Africa and parts of Asia Pacific, I think it's the consideration for balancing the risk posed to other aircraft with the benefit of engaging with that type of technology. So it's made easier by the lower amounts of legacy aviation, the work of aid agencies and ministries of health. And I think that's a testament to partners on the ground there who can help demonstrate that viability and value in their use case to those sorts of regulators.
Just add into that, I think the areas of emergency services, I think probably lead sets of applications for here in Australia. There was a fantastic initiative announced by the ANU and Optus in relation to looking at the application of drones, robotics and satellites in relation to fire management. And that's the whole cycle of looking at being able to early detect and then have autonomous water tankers, observation, all of those things. I think that's a classic example of where it can be used. We did see also some wonderful initiatives by the surf lifeguard in Bondi Beach, who showed how we could, rapidly deploy life-saving equipment out to a drowning person out in sea. So I think that in that area of emergency services, I think we've got the ideal opportunity to really understand the risks associated with protection of life and property, and use those as ideal opportunities to guide our policy creation, regulation, and the like.
I think that's a really good point raised by Rocky. So there's groups like the Little Ripper Group who are using drones to fly out personal flotation devices to individuals in distress, and also use that for shark spotting as well to protect the public. Yeah. I think the second part, though, we really already have that framework in place. So CASA and government regulators have the ability to do so. It's just a time-consuming process to get there.
Yeah, I think also, though, it's a completely different approach to fire management. And so how that is systematized within a state, I think, becomes quite important alongside of regional fire crews and management and the like. So there's a lot of things that are technically possible today, but augmenting that, I think, with existing systems is where there's probably a lot of opportunity to to work on, good frameworks, regulation and the like.
Yeah, I suppose the last 12 months has really been a disruptive and transformational 12 months with the bushfires and now with the COVID pandemic. We're really seeing that the thinking around what should we apply this technology to. And to your point, Greg, there's been applications around moving goods and medical supplies using the autonomous vehicles so that it minimises the human interaction with some of these products. The delivery side around, the on-demand delivery, contactless delivery, where before we used to complain when the driver wouldn't leave, wouldn't knock on the door and hand us. Now we're almost, offended if they dare to hand us something. So I think we have seen a real catalyst and an enabler coming out of some of the huge disruption, and we've heard about bushfires. So just back to Zach, if I can, just give you an opportunity to tell us, how you see Swoop Aero potentially expanding its presence in Australia, and how maybe you could be the catalyst of a change to air logistics.
Yeah, thank you. I think to your last point about that sort of touchless or no contact delivery, I think we found that a really good catalyst overseas, especially in areas that don't necessarily have transportation corridors between them. So there were serious concerns about the movement or spread of virus between areas that have not necessarily historically been in touch. So being able to provide that no contact link provided them the opportunity to remain isolated and remain virus free, which is really fantastic. I think to the expansion and future in Australia, so as Rocky pointed out, we think of that ourselves more as a logistics company rather than a drone company. And so we value having that system and that architecture in place much more highly than any individual aircraft. So we've developed a strong system that supports our entire operations, which is fit for purpose for one aircraft or 1,000 aircraft. So whilst we have that in place, that's fantastic. I think there's a few leverage points that we need to expand into Australia properly. And that's just as a result of the much higher levels of aviation in Australia. So there's everything from Qantas down to a person flying over the beaches of Sydney for fun. So I think being able to expand more fully into countries like Australia does require integration into airspace, which is being actively worked on now, which is really exciting. I think Air Services Australia have put in place some really good information management systems. So once again, as Rocky was talking about, having those systems that oversight and oversee all of the active players in a scenario like a bushfire or like a wildfire, it provides the opportunity to be better integrated. I think in terms of our operations in Australia, so we are similar in that we are first and last mile logistics. So looking at where we can best put ourselves into the logistics flow to make sure we're getting things to their destination in a timely manner. So I think the good parable or good analogy is that a Qantas flight might bring life-saving medication into a regional or remote town. That's then loaded onto a Swoop Aero aircraft, and we get that to an individual within an hour, possibly, flying over inhospitable terrain, rather than waiting for a car which might only be able to travel 20 kilometres an hour, where that medication is lumped in with everything, just like your ASOS order would be. So I think there's some exciting opportunities there, and looking to expand into not just delivering medications, but how we can help solve other public health and public good options, like things like wildfires, like surf lifesaving, all those sort of options where a drone is fit for purpose, and we feel we can actually provide good value.
Absolutely. Rocky, are you still there? If I just throw to you.
Yes.
Yeah, so just on your survey that you did of the business sector, how much of that do you think is influenced by what they've actually had exposure to, some of the questions that you asked, and maybe if they spoke to some of our experts that we've heard from today, maybe they'd have a slightly different perception about when the autonomous technology might be in Australia?
Yeah, so a little bit about the study. It involved approximately 700 professionals across all sorts of professions. 170 of those were CEOs, and probably about another third of them were from, technology-based roles, CIOs, CTOs. So I don't know whether or to what extent knowledge is widely how widely understood autonomous vehicles and the roadmaps and things are. I wouldn't say that it's probably the highest priority. I think right now the technologies that Australian professionals think are going to be the most disruptive over the coming 3 years will be artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, 3G, cyber and information security. But the important point again is, Rita, these are all inextricably linked. They're not sort of individual technologies unto themselves. But again, I really think it's going to be use cases that are not the ones we see on primetime TV news around autonomous vehicles, such as delivering pizza to a ship full of people that are that have got COVID. We all saw those applications. I don't think they're the killer apps. I think, as I said before, I think emergency services will be the area where it'll be also mostly used. The other thing I'd say as well is those leaders who manage large-scale operations, such as mobile communications companies who've got towers everywhere, using that technology to check, technology to do service and the like. I think so it's the industrial side that I think we're going to see emerge first, rather than perhaps the consumer one. But I wouldn't say, Rita, it's top of the pops.
Thanks. We want to throw it open to you now. We've got some questions that people have asked us to Canvas when they registered, but also I want to open it to the floor. If there's any questions from anybody?
I think we've got 5 in the Q&A.
Yeah, we do. I can't see it though. I'm just, what if I ask one of the questions that some people asked on registration? So maybe this is one to both Greg and Zach, and Rocky, you can answer this. Is, how far behind are the regulatory authorities in allowing some of this technology to be introduced? That's one of the questions from Greg. Do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. We touched on that a bit earlier. From a regulations perspective, in Australia, we're #1 in the world. And it's not me who said it, it's KPMG who issue this report every year regarding readiness of autonomous vehicle, and they classified each country. So we've got a very comprehensive, a very good regulatory framework, and that's great, but now we actually have to test this framework. And we're at a stage of development where deployment is intimately connected with the regulatory side. What I'd like to see in Australia, and one of the biggest barriers, is we've moved past the innovator segment for this technology. And I think in Australia, we took a first bite at the cherry. We had some great first wave of trial with various state government commissioning projects. And I feel that, now their approach is that, they've tested it, they understand what the technology is at, and they're happy to wait for a few more years before the next wave of development. And I would counter that by the fact that, the government has a duty to provide this favorable environment for this kind of technology, because you cannot underhype the long-term benefit of this technology, especially from a safety perspective. We're losing 1.3 million globally. We're losing 1.3 million people on the road every year to road accident that could be avoided, because 90% of these are due to human error. So I think to just discard that and think that, we're going to need wait 10, 15 years before we look at it again would be a very big mistake. And we'd be lagging behind even more. I think that we need to take the bull by the horn and look at the funding piece, because it's an emerging technology, and we're at a time where we need the government to help promote this technology.
Thanks, Greg. Zach, do you want to respond? You sort of touched on it a bit around the regulations, aviation regulations.
Yeah, definitely. I think in Australia, we're quite fortunate to have a really strong policy and framework set up within government and CASA. And I think there's some really cool research going into certification of autonomy. So like Greg said before, working with an already certified vehicle is a great opportunity. In aviation, it's not so much for us. So there's groups like the Trusted Autonomous Systems, which are our corporate research center, cooperative research center, sorry, who do some really interesting research to allow those sort of things to be certified. I think in terms of standards to comply with, so often we need standards to certify a particular aircraft. I think worldwide we're quite behind. So the technology and the want of operators is outpacing what anyone can come up with. And I think within Australia, capability and resourcing, we're significantly behind. So providing the right resourcing to groups like CASA to then review our applications is holding the industry back a bit. And I think just on that last part, if we don't start investing and doing more in that space, there are lots of programs internationally, especially throughout Africa with the Fourth Industrial Revolution programs, which are going to mean they do leapfrog Australia in those sort of opportunities.
Rita, we've had a few questions come from online. Clearly some people are very passionate about getting autonomous vehicles so they don't need to drive anymore. So I'll rapid fire, I might mold a couple into one question. First things first, when can we finally get rid of seatbelts and airbags? And secondly, what happens if I crash? Like comments around the insurance and regulatory landscape and how insurers are starting to think about a world where maybe there's not a driver in the car.
Yeah, sure. And you know, I'm sure you'll have plenty to say as well in that space. Rita, feel free to jump in. You know, the first thing you say, I think I'm extremely keen as well to see them on the road for different reasons. I've never owned a car, a traditional car, and I'm hoping my first car will be autonomous. You know, I'll try to wait 10, 15 years. I've got a young baby now, so I might not be able to, but I'm really looking forward to see them on the road as well. Look, seatbelt and airbag, it comes back to the safety case and the development of the technology. We need to be able to prove that this vehicle will be able to evolve under any type of condition in any situation. And it's difficult because, you know, there's an infinite number of corner cases as well, you know, when it comes to the road and the unpredictability of our behavior as drivers. So there's going to be an awkward period of time where you're going to have autonomous vehicle and traditional vehicles driven by, you know, just human drivers, which is going to create some complexity. So I think no seatbelt and airbags. You know, we're probably looking at the same timeline that we've discussed earlier, when we'll be in full level 5 automation or level 5 within some operation domain design. I'd say 10, 15 years, maybe a little bit more. And the second part of your question, you know, what happens in case of a crash? Very, you know, topical and very interesting for insurers who, you know, who appreciate that their business is at for major disruption for autonomous vehicle. And we've already started seeing some cases of accident, you know, when we try to cut corners and go a bit too quick, especially in the US. And there was a ruling recently, you know, in the Uber incident that happened a couple of years ago in Arizona, I think, or in Texas. And the safety operator was deemed responsible in this case because they were checking their mobile phone instead of keeping their eyes on the road. Eventually, when we're in fully autonomous mode, you know, I think it will have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it might be the provider of the autonomous software, could be the provider of the sensors if they're different, or it could be the car manufacturer if it's a mechanical fault. So, you know, I think that's how it's going to pan out.
Yeah, so just from the organisation that I represent, we have over 150 partners, and we're very pleased to have all the major insurers in Australia as part of our partnership, and they provide us deep insights into what they're involved in Australia and what they're looking at and what their partnerships overseas are telling them. So we also have Volvo Car, who's one of our major partners, and Volvo has come out a few years ago and said when their vehicle is operating in the autonomous mode, they will take full responsibility for any incidents occurring. So that's the sort of responsibility that we want OEMs to take. If they tell the driver to hand over control to a system, then they should be responsible for that system. A lot of the technology that we do see now in vehicles still expects the driver to be in control. And that's where you get these grey areas around responsibility. But at the moment, the driver is always responsible for the vehicle. And we don't have any vehicles in Australia where they're fully driverless in any conditions. I think it's really important to talk about the future in relation to 3 dimensions. So we've got the 2 dimensions now with regards to the aerial transport and land transport. But I think we're going to see the progress in very different speeds around on-road and off-road. And definitely Australia is a world leader in off-road automation around our mining and also our ports. So we've got the most advanced port in Victoria and Brisbane. We've also got the most advanced deployment of autonomous mining trucks in the world in Australia. So we really have a point of difference. So if we look at on-road versus off-road, and to Greg's point, on-road in certain applications on-road, there's definitely a very fast timeline for deployment of some of those technologies.
This is probably a stupid question, but has anyone developed robots to actually convert a normal vehicle to an autonomous vehicle? Like something that actually puts weight on an accelerator and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's the aftermarket technology. And you see that there's, the Uber vehicle that was the crash was actually a Volvo vehicle with the Uber technology, automation system put onto it. And reportedly, the Volvo system turned off with the new system. So we're seeing that we've got some vehicles in Australia that have had some technology put on them. And some of those are done with the support and collaboration with the vehicle manufacturer. And some of them are technology that, supersedes the capabilities. So yeah, definitely. Not for, well, it depends. If you've got the money to be able to afford some of these systems to put into your vehicle, you can probably do it. But they're research vehicles at the moment and you can't register them as a traditional vehicle.
There's a lot of, just to complete that, there's a lot of challenges with retrofitting traditional internal combustion engine vehicle with autonomous vehicle technology. As Easymile, our strategy is to partner with OEMs to co-develop a product, and it makes things a whole lot easier and more efficient and streamlined as well. If you were to try and, say, retrofit your traditional car with this kind of technology, firstly, you'd probably need a drive-by-wire kit to turn some of the processes in your mechanical car into electric signal. Which are much more suited for the operations of AVs. That's why we generally try to start from an electric vehicle. And then you have to remember that these vehicles are supercomputer on wheels at the moment. So until we have 5G and edge computing, which can potentially help us to take the computers outside the vehicle and centralize that process, we need a very consistent, powerful source of energy. An electric vehicle would achieve that. Traditional vehicle, not so much. So there's a lot of complexities around the retrofit, but it is possible.
I think every state in Australia has at least 1 or 2. We've got a few here that have been repurposed with some of this additional technology, the drive-by-wire and some of the other automation systems. So there's a lot of work going on. A lot of the universities have got a number of these vehicles. They're a great test platform to understand how the technology works and how the sensors, the mapping systems, the perception systems actually integrate together. So there's a lot of activity happening in Australia. So we've got time for how many more questions? 1 more question.
We've had one come through online, which might be a good wrap-up question.
Sure.
And the comment was in relation to last night's budget. I mean, there was obviously a massive focus on skills, particularly for young people. And you're seeing a whole lot of incentives around trying to help young people navigate their future careers, as well as work with new emerging, very exciting companies like the 2 that are in today's presentation. What would be the advice around, or to reframe, what are the sorts of skills that we're going to need to support Australia in this new, exciting, emerging future, which is autonomous vehicles?
Maybe to Zach and Greg, and then I might talk about how we think we'll facilitate that. Okay.
Sure, I'll start. Look, at this stage of Australia's development, what we need is a lot of field and deployment engineers, because you need the support to be able to develop these solutions. That's why it's so important for us to have this local presence. We like working with universities, and they're often the research partner on the project that we have deployed. And it's great because it provides a fantastic platform for students as well to get involved in this project, to understand it, and potentially have this project as team for their PhDs as well. Looking forward, more toward the kind of timeline that Woki as a futurist is looking at, 10, 15 years. What would be fantastic is to look at the industrialization component of autonomous vehicle. We're behind the golden age of automotive, as you know, in South Australia, in Australia as well. But to reinvent ourselves as a pole for autonomous vehicle manufacturing would be fantastic. And, we'd need a lot of car designer, more engineers, potentially some sensors that are made locally, like Bauhaus in Sydney and so on and so forth. So, if we can pull this off, I mean, we could become number one, and just, cut the grass under Singapore's feet. So,
Zach, maybe to your industry sector?
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, there are a few big areas. So looking at advanced manufacturing, different materials, different products. Coding is a huge one for us. So making sure that the autonomous systems are fit for purpose and that they're doing what we want them to do. Engineers, just in all sorts and flavors. And also, I suppose, probably the biggest one for us at the moment is operational problem solvers. So people who've done hackathons where they get some actual experience, they can develop a solution and then present that solution as well. So they have that full experience of going from this is the problem to presenting that solution, which is a skill that we're finding more and more useful as the days go by.
Yeah, and just to conclude, there was a lot of talk this week around fees for engineering and the reduction in fees, not necessarily just engineering, but the reduction of fees for those sectors that we really want to encourage people to come into. So I think, that's a really positive sign and a really good encourager, but I think also it's the pathway in high schools, essentially to get people into those disciplines that we're going to need in the future. Data scientists are in great demand in this sector, and engineering across a range of disciplines, but also urban planners and designers, and Greg touched on that. And we also need people to understand the human-machine interface and that psychology of how people are going to interact with this technology. So there's a real wide ecosystem of skills, and I think we're well placed in Australia to be able to supply that.
Please join me in thanking, it's been a long day, Rita, Greg, Rocky, Zach, for today's brilliant conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you both.